Well, hello everyone. Welcome to Searches UK and Landmark Planning webinar. I'm Philip Hill. I work for Landmark Information Group. Today's day is 13th of May 2020, and I'm here today. I'm going to talk to you about planning. But before I get started, a tiny bit of housekeeping. This is going to last about 50 minutes, I think. I'd normally say if you've got any questions, type them in your questions box, but we're recording it, so it's not no, you can't do that today. So the housekeeping is it should last for about 50 minutes. If you've got any questions, the last slide has got Searches UK's phone number and email on. If you've got any questions, please ask the excellent Samantha Manning. Okay, we'll make a start. So what are we going to talk about today? Let me just get the first slide going. So we're going to talk about the importance of planning. Only two things actually: the importance of planning issues and conveyancing, a bit of planning policy and legislation. Not going into too much detail. A couple of recent changes, mostly about permitted development. Got a few planning case studies I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you our planning report, and then I'll finish on something I call simplifying your search pack. So the first one is the importance of planning issues in conveyancing. So let me just get these up. So all properties would ideally be considered in the context of their surrounding environment. All are subject to the environment changing in one way or another, whether it's the adjoining property in the immediate neighbourhood, or in some cases further away, perhaps a mile or so away. Sometimes there can be physical changes, such as a new road being constructed, or an extension to the property. In others, it can be through a change of use, such as a family house being changed into a guest house, for instance, or a shop or takeaway, or an HMO, house of multiple occupation. Now, a developer client, residential or commercial, or an investment property purchaser would like to know whether planning will impact on what they'd like to do a property, or will it affect their use and enjoyment of the property. And if it's going to be bought as an investment property, if it will affect their ability to let the property as well. So you might be looking at someone taking a property on a short lease or a freehold, someone who may be occupying themselves or intending to let it out. So let's look at some of the considerations. So we've got three here. I'm going to mention the property itself, the local area, and further afield to major energy infrastructure and infrastructure projects such as HS2, if it ever gets going, I think it is, and Crossrail 1 and 2, of course. So the property itself. So there is the question of the property itself having been changed in some way without having the necessary planning consent. So it's not illegal to build without planning permission. However, in a worst case scenario, a client could buy a property only to find that a local planning authority was to take enforcement action in respect of part or all of the building. So enforcement action being, I don't go into detail in these slides, but they can force a stop, and in extreme cases they can certainly in the UK, they can force you to take the building down. I'll show you an example of that. So it's important to establish there have been no breaches of planning law in the construction or use of the property. For example, it could be that an extension was built which did require, but did not get planning consent. It's also possible that the property has had a change of use without the required consent. An example might be a flat above a shop where the current planning consent only permits it to be used as a shop. I'm going to go into changes in permitted development in a few minutes' time. So the two rules are there's the 4 and the 10 year. People obviously people sometimes just miss out the 10-year one, so it's the 4-year one. So the 4-year one, has there been a change of use? So has there been a physical change to the property in the last 4 years? And the second one is, has there been a change of use of the property in the last 10 years? So if there's no permission for either, assuming that permission was needed in the first place, there may have been a breach of planning, and the local planning authority can take enforcement action. And also, if you don't have any planning law, of course, people can run right. You can end up with monstrosities like you can see on the right here. So wherever this is, there either isn't any planning law, or if there is, it's extremely relaxed, or someone's done it without getting planning permission. So enforcement action. So enforcement action, I said, can be taken when there's breach of planning, so building without permission. So Mr. Fiddler is a good example here. So I've talked about this is a physical change. So this is the 4-year. Remember, there's a 4-year rule. So Mr. Fiddler, I was going to say he was a farmer. He's still a farmer, cattle farmer in Redhill, Surrey. He wanted to build a new build house, but he thought he wouldn't bother getting planning permission. His solution was to build it in secret behind, there we are, behind 40-foot high walls of hay. Now, he started it in 2001, completed it in June 2002. Pretty good going, considering what he built, and moved in with his family. However, he kept it hidden behind the bales for a further 4 years until July 2006. Now, look at that. Quite magnificent. Now, he did this because he thought he'd take advantage of the rule. Town and Country Planning Act, section 171B, I think, from memory, I think it is, it's 171B, which provides immunity of service of an enforcement notice where 4 years have elapsed from the substantial completion of an operational development, end quote. So when Mr. Fiddler unveiled his house in 2006, the local planning authority were unimpressed and they served an enforcement notice. Now, the case generated loads of publicity. If you Google or whatever your preferred search engine is, Fiddler's Castle or Fiddler's Castle Redhill or Fiddler Planning, FIDLER, you know, sure as eggs or eggs, you'll come up with something about this. So it generated a lot of publicity, not least because his house resembled a castle, complete with twin turrets and even a cannon, possibly against as defence against the local. I don't think I've got a picture of the cannon. I think it's on the ground floor somewhere. There it is. Possibly as defence against the local planning enforcement officers. Now, Mr. Fiddler didn't like this. He brought proceedings against the High Court challenging the enforcement notice. And I think the case was, I'm not quite sure this, let me check my notes. Fiddler versus Secretary of State for Secretary of State for Common Communities and Local Government and another, 2010. If you're interested, case references EWHC 143. Now, the judge held that the removal of the bales and plastic sheeting formed an intrinsic part of the overall building operations, and that the building operations were not substantially completed until the bales were removed. Now, whilst the judge categorised the removal of the straw bales and tarpaulins as ancillary activities, he held as a matter of fact a decree they were nonetheless part of the overall building operation. So he thought he'd try and pull a fast one. Poor old Mr. Fiddler, after I can't remember the number of times he went to court against this, but he tried a couple of defences. One of them was he'd sold the property to an Indian businessman who he couldn't remember. That was one of them. And another one of them was he claimed he is a dairy farmer and he needed to be close to his herd of cattle. You know, they were eventually they're all thrown out, and he had to pull it down. And when you look at the structure of the property, it looks like it's 2 corrugated iron silos with maybe some polystyrene internal cladding, you know, for insulation, and 1 brick skin. So these days you would not normally be allowed to get away with this type of construction. You know, you've they would typically want something more substantial than this, something that's going to last. Anyway, you can see, in my opinion, it wasn't fit for purpose, although at first glance it looked pretty impressive. So poor old Mr. Fiddler, he had his day in court, or days in court. His house lasted 10 years, not as long as he would have liked it. And because he didn't get planning permission, he was asked to take it down. Now, this is a good time to mention the Localism Act 2011. So this enables local planning authorities, or LPAs, to take action against landowners who attempt to deliberately conceal a build that they needed but did not get planning permission for. So when it comes to the attention of a local planning authority that such a breach has occurred outside of the time limits during which an enforcement notice could have been served, so 4 years for physical change of use, 10 years for change of use, they will be able to apply to the local magistrates court for a planning enforcement order. So poor old Mr. Fiddler, that's 1 loophole sealed, I think. Now the next thing I said I'll talk about was the local area. So local neighbourhoods will always will always change to a greater or lesser extent. As a general rule, the further away from the property, the greater the development will have to be to have an impact generally. So, for example, if the property next door to me is planning permission to demolish the existing house and it's going to build a block of flats, then for me it will be pretty significant. But it might be of little relevance to the person half a mile away or the other end of the road. On the other hand, everyone in the street is likely to be concerned that the field opposite has planning permission to be developed into a new housing estate. Or for instance, an industrial estate may carry industrial waste. It may affect the buyer's view of their home and their client's use and enjoyment of the property. Now, at the extreme end of this are the infrastructure projects, such often a national scale, that can affect whole communities. These kind of projects are normally highly controversial. Perhaps the best current example being the proposed HS2 line, which is going to start, I think, near London Euston and end up near Birmingham New Street. Now, change of use will always be relevant. An example might be changing a restaurant into a nightclub, for instance. This could have a very big impact on local residents, especially the amount of noise at night, primarily from people leaving late at night. I've got an example of this. A lady I used to work with, a Landmark, a few years ago. She lived in a block of flats in Birmingham. I forget what floor she was on. It's something like a 6 or 7 story block, and I think let's call it the 2nd floor. And 6 months after she moved in, planning permission was applied for to turn the basement into a nightclub, which they eventually got. And she said it was dreadful, from Thursday through to Saturday, it didn't stop till 4 AM. So and this sort of information won't be shown in the local search. So it's important to get this information, I think, to your clients. So when is planning permission required? So I'm going to look at the meaning of development. So that the Town and Country Planning Act 1990, it remains the cornerstone of legislation of the current planning system. The key section is the meaning of development. Oh, it's worth saying that our initial Town and Country Planning Act was 1947, and the UK became the first country in the world to have a national planning code. So whilst there have been many detailed amendments over the last 60 or 70 years or so, the basic principles and structure has remained similar. And the meaning of development today is, let me read this, development, quote, means the carrying out of building, engineering, mining or other operations in, on, over or under land, or the making of any material change in the use of buildings or other land. So we can see here there's really 2 parts to this section. The first is the physical doing. So we mentioned this a few minutes earlier, such as building a property. Usually it'd be obvious by looking at the site or the property, that the land or the land, that some kind of physical development has taken place. And the second part is the change of use. Here, from a physical inspection, it might not be at all apparent that change of use has happened. For example, changing a normal residential property in planning terms is called a dwelling house into a house of multiple occupation, so HMO that has more than one single family, typically student let or multiple let, where you have 3 or 4 people living in one house with shared facilities. And the other key section too is section 57, which simply says that before you carry out any development, you need planning permission. So let me read section 57 out here. Quote, subject to the following provisions of this section, planning permission is required for the carrying out of any development of land, end quote. So it's not an offence to breach planning law, but if this does happen, as with Mr. Fiddler, then the local planning authority, or LPA, is likely to take enforcement action. There are a number of notices available to the LPA, but the most common is the enforcement notice. Now, I mentioned time limits, so yeah, I've mentioned this, but let me gloss over it. So section 171B, I think, where there's been a breach of planning control consisting of the carrying out without planning permission of building, engineering, mining or other operations in, on or over the land, no enforcement action may be taken after the end of the period of 4 years, beginning with the date on which the operations were substantially completed. And number 2 is where there's been a breach of planning control consisting in the change of use of any building to use as a single dwelling house, no enforcement action may be taken after the end of the period of 10 years beginning with the date of the breach. In the case of any other breach of planning control, no enforcement action may be taken after the end of a period of 10 years beginning with the date of the breach. So to counter the fiddler type of case that we mentioned earlier, Section 124 of the Localism Act 2011 now expressly states that enforcement action may be taken against a breach of planning control when the time limits for taking action have expired and the breach was concealed. There you go, Mr. Fiddler. So the Growth and Infrastructure Act. What on earth is this? So it was designed to promote economic growth. It was brought in some years ago, right after the end of the last recession, so 2009, 2010 time. So it increased permitted development rights for housing extensions. It was originally done for 3 years from 2013 to May 2016, and then it was extended for another 3 years, where larger single-story rear extensions can be made permanent. I've got a little bit of this on the next slide. And also, it prevents land registered as a town and village green if trigger events have taken place. So it stops retrospective planning being sought for village greens where a planning permission has already been sought. And also, if a neighbour objects to the new permitted development rights, then the local plan authority, they have to consider the impact. So although there are permitted development rights, if it's brought to the local authorities or the local planning authorities, if the local planning authority is told, they have to consider the impact. And major planning applications, you apply directly to the Secretary of State. Now these are the permitted development rights. So extensions to the rear of the property now up to 6 metres without planning, a single story level. There's a couple of other caveats to this. If you check this in the local planning portal, there'll be a restriction on height. I think it's something like 2.1 metres, and it can't be more than or less than 2 metres from an adjoining property if the property is detached. And there's a few other things. So if it's semi or terraces up to 3 metres, detached up to 4, you must write to the local authority. You must consult with immediate neighbours, immediate being left, right, opposite, behind, and confirmation should be given within 42 days. But you still need building regs. Now, building regs are a really good idea. They're one of these little things that if you're not familiar with the planning law, you might never be aware of. So we had some work done on our property that was finished last year. We got planning permission. I think the planning permission was, I can't remember if we did it in one go or two. Let's say one. It was something like £160, £170, something like that. We're down here in Sussex by the sea. But the building regs cost £1,200. But that's not a bad thing because it's kind of like a quality control on the development. So the building regulation officer from the local authority comes around and inspects the development at different parts of the build. They also inspect the plans, and in fact, in our case, they made some edits to the strengths of the beams that we're having in the roof. So they wanted them beefed up a bit. So I'm not a structural engineer, so it was quite good to have them beefed up. You know, it cost a little bit more money, but it was good. And they make sure that the building materials and the depth of the foundations, for instance, are suitable quality and depth to support the new buildings. You know, so it's like having a quality control. So it's still a good thing. Now there were some revised permitted development rights from about this time last year. So large single-story extensions have been made permanent, so that's good. A couple of little finer points I'm going to touch on here. Allow shops A1, financial and professional services, A2, hot food takeaways A5, betting shops, payday loan shops and laundrettes. They can change use to an office, so B1A without planning permission. Hot food takeaways A5 can change to residential use, C3 without planning permission. And there's no extension of permitted development rights for storage to residential use, which ends next month, the 10th of June 2020, and still being considered are permitted development rights allowing office buildings to be demolished and replaced with residential homes. Other matters including upward extensions, these are called air rights in the States, due to be covered in autumn this year as well. it's useful to know. So it cuts a little bit of red tape. You'll still need building regs, but like I say, it's a very, very useful thing to have. Now, the Planning Act 2008, this was designed to speed up the planning process. So there's no need for a planning process for major infrastructures, in major infrastructure projects such as HS2. It was brought in largely in response to the planning permission for Terminal 5 at Heathrow. Now, this is not you'd be mistaken for thinking that £800 million was the cost of the build of Terminal 5. £800 million, which is taxpayers' money, that's you and me, is the cost of the planning inquiry, and it took 4 years. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, I'm just saying it's expensive. And the three main changes are whether the infrastructure project is needed is decided by the government. It's not a matter for a planning inquiry, so no more £800 million planning inquiries. It should streamline the number of consents required, obviously, and the final decision, if it's needed, is taken by the Secretary of State. So HS2, for instance, there's no planning permission. In fact, it went to a public consultation, and the majority of people said that they didn't want it. Nevertheless, it's still going ahead. Let's have a look at some case studies now. So it kind of brings it to life here. So the first one is about views. So this is down in Brighton. This is, if you're not familiar with Brighton, you have the Marina, which started off as a fairly low-rise development some 20 or 30 years ago. And just opposite it, just slightly above it, on the modest cliffs, is a building called Marina Gate. Now, so it's a very, very big building. If you buy that property, you'll probably, or you might be buying for the view, because there's almost uninterrupted sea views. There's the marina, you know, like 300 or 400 or 500 meters away, but there's absolutely lovely views here. Now, these views aren't protected because the marina is expanding. So this is what is going there. Now, if you could just got a local authority search, this would not be in the local authority search. And you can see here, here's our planning report. There's Marina Gate right in the middle of the circle. And number 9, which I've shown here, this is the plan for what's going on there. You can see in that graphic there, you can see Marina Gate just to the far right at the bottom. The development to the left, so with the tower and all the blocks above about 2 or 3 stories is what's been put through planning. So they've started building that now. So if you bought a property in Marina Gate thinking that you're going to have these marvelous sea views and you pay a premium for that, then you are going to be slightly disappointed. And I always say this, but planning is subjective. So I don't think I'd mind too much about this, but you know, to some people it may be horrendously disruptive. You know, it may ruin the property for them. But it's certainly our job to tell them about it. The next case study is up in Hollingworth in Hyde, which is Greater Manchester, slightly to the southeast. So we were asked to search this property. The property in question is just about where, just to the left of the car in the graphic on the left. It enjoys what I would call great views, possibly over the Peak District, or in the background looking at the graphic in number 2, depending on exactly where it is. So to me, this property would carry a premium for me. So I know you should never buy for a view, simply because the view might not be permanent. You can guess where this is going. So you buy this property, and the icing on the cake has got a great view. However, looking at our planning report here, you can see there are some applications within 250 meters. Quite unusual that there's 7 applications to build between 10 and 50 new properties. So let's have a look at the map. There's the property just about where the eye is in Hollingworth. There's the football ground opposite. And number 2, just below the 100-meter mark, 100-meter circle, former Organ Inn, 38 houses. Now, so this application may cause an impact on enjoyment, use and enjoyment and value, maybe, depending on how you feel about this type of thing. Now, should proof be needed, I've cross-referenced this to the local planning portal, and there you can see demolition of the pub and erection of 38 2-, 3-, and 4-bed houses, including land back to the rear of the public house with associated landscaping, access and car parking. So there's plenty of information you get in the local planning portal. So I've been able to get the developer's plan. Now, even if you consider this is going to be the best development in the land, and you know, why wouldn't it be? Because the developer will want to get as much money as they can for each individual property. Still, that view is changing. So, and I'm trying to think of something positive here. If you were a local shop owner, perhaps a convenient, you know, let's call it corner shop, you'd have 38 more people or 38 more families to sell your goods to. It could be the best thing that's ever happened to you. But if you've bought that property as a residential property, you know, the one we're looking at, and the icing on the cake was the view, and you paid a premium, perhaps one around the corner that, nice as it is, overlooked another row of terrace houses, perhaps you paid a bit more because it didn't have this view. This is the way I feel. It's not everyone's view, but I would pay a little bit more. But I would certainly check, knowing what I know now. So these have been built. No use of the football, no use of the peaks. Now, it's not for us to decide if that's a good or bad thing. It's just for us to tell the purchaser that this is going on, and it's up to them to decide if it's a positive or negative thing for them. So there you go. Now I've got another planning case study. This is down in Southampton. So we've got the north-south parity thing going on here. So this is, these boundaries I haven't drawn particularly well. The red boundary should go down to the boundary with Archers Road, and the yellow one, for those of you with colour monitors just to the right, should also go down to the boundary with Archers Road. But you get the idea. The properties we're interested in are the corner property edged in red and Glen Court to the right edged in yellow. So 38 Archers Road, I was going to say it's not there. It is there. It's just changed. There's Glen Court in the background. So it's been changed. It's being built to it's being built as a 3-story, by the looks of things, block of flats. Now, you can see it's taking a bit of light. Even if you can look to, there's Glen Court to the left there, it's taking a bit of light. Those are downpipes there, so those are loos, bathrooms, kitchens, but that is still fairly close to Glen Court, taking a bit of light maybe. So if you looked at our planning report, you can see here, unusually on the 3rd row down, 9 applications for new builds, 10 to 50 dwellings. Now this is a really unusual case, but let me show you what's unusual about it. So if you have a look at the bottom entry on our planning report, 39 Archers Road, planning permission was refused on the 19th of March 2008. So how many flats was it refused? 11 flats. So the layperson might think, brilliant, job done. Either the developer is going to go away, maybe submit a more modest application for less than 11 flats, but or just go away completely, and you know, life's going to go on without that building changing at all. However, go up to the next one, 2.5 years later, or 3.5 years later, September 2011, on the same site, 39 Archers Road, planning permission was granted for 20 flats. So even though it was refused 3.5 years ago, or 3.5 years before, planning permission was put through for almost double the number of flats. Now the development size hasn't changed. You can see 1,400 square meters to 1,406. It's changed by 6.1 square meters, so virtually the same size, but they've allowed almost double the number of flats. So just because planning permission has been turned down, it doesn't necessarily mean that it won't be granted in the future. And the last one, so this is quite a well-known one. This is Thorpe versus Abbott. Thorpe's for the purchasers. They bought a lovely property, Oakwood Lodge in Droitwich in Worcestershire, and they completed on it on the 14th of October 2010. Now, not long after, i.e. a month or so, 5 weeks so, outline planning permission was granted for 740 nearby dwellings. So Mrs. Thorpe, 3 months later, objected to the planning. And I've taken this from her objection. Let me read it. I'm going to read this verbatim. Quote, I live on Pulley Lane, Droitwich, and I'm very concerned about the prospect of an extensive new development in the area between Roman Way and Cupcut Lane, Solwarp. I already have difficulty turning right across the A38 when I exit Pulley Lane in the direction of Droitwich due to the number of vehicles already using the A38 daily. Consequently, the thought of a significant increase in traffic and the safety issues this raises is a major source of concern to me. Quite right. It's thought, so it went to court. However, 2 years later, planning permission was granted for the development. It went to court. The hearing date was June 2015, and the purchaser's case was that the truthful answers in the questions asked in the property information form would have revealed proposals, or this was the old TA6, by the way, would have revealed proposals for large-scale development in the vicinity of the property, which would have caused them to withdraw from the purchase. And the seller's position was that their answers were true because the only development in prospect at the time of the sale was one which does not affect the property and was so not required to be disclosed by them. So the key words were, well, it's their opinion and that it did not affect the property, not the surrounding area. It did not affect that single property they were selling. So the possibility, which has become reality because the development's been built now, the development of the site was not such as to require disclosure in their own words. So the old Tier 6, the relevant questions, it's been updated by the way now, but the relevant sections in section 3 was, has the seller either sent or received any communication or notices which in any way may affect the property, for example, from or to neighbours, the council or a government department? If so, please supply a copy. 3.2, has the seller had any negotiations or discussions with any neighbour or any local or other authority affecting the property in any way? If yes, please supply details. Both questions were answered no by the sellers, the Abbots. So they said, no, there's nothing that will affect the property in any way. Now, our planning report showed that there were over planning, but this is the biggie. So we start at the top, alterations for single dwellings, then we go down to up to 10 to 50, and then over 50. So these are large developments. So the new build over 50 are fairly large, from 50 dwellings upwards. So this is on the property. There's to the left, there's the graphic. It looks like a really nice leafy lane, if I can describe it that way. But let me draw your attention to the field to the northwest. So have a look at the graphic opposite. Let me draw your attention to numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. So in that lane, in that field opposite the target property, so the property that Thorpe bought is right in the middle, so in the purple dot of the 500-metre radius. So there's Oakwood Lodge. 1, 2, 3, 4. Let me see what those are. Let me show you in our planning report. So number 1, appearance, layout, scale and landscaping of proposed housing development. Okay, fine. If you want to know more about this, by the way, you just click on that reference. So in this case, 14/01153, it takes you to the local planning portal and you can have a look at the proposed development in a lot more detail. Planning 2, mixed use development to provide 740 residential units. So there you go, number 3. So it's one of the last ones. Reserve matters, phase 1, comprising 291 developments, including 110 extra care apartments, 265. So this is a phased development because of the size. And number 4, 740 housing units, offices, shops, cafes. So quite a large development, quite close to Oakwood Lodge. So the court ruled in favour of the sellers, so the Abbots, holding the sellers' answers were not misrepresentations. Now, this is really interesting. The judge stated the words communication and affecting used in the questions in the Tier 6 should each be given a relatively confined interpretation in favour of the seller. The judge then further argued, now, let me read this, the starting point of a conveyancing transaction is still buyer beware. For those of you that didn't study Latin at school, caveat emptor is buyer beware. The questions on the property information form are intended to be capable of answer by a layperson and should not be interpreted in such a way that expert advice would be needed to understand the information required. And the other questions in the property information form were consistent with an interpretation of the inquiry raised by question 3 was to matters which were either directly about the property itself or concerning immediately adjoining properties, not regarding planning proposals a distance away from the property. And question 3.2 in the TA6 referred to negotiations and discussions specifically with a neighbour or authority affecting the property, and still quoting, discussion with someone not in a position to carry out or authorise the proposal, such as a local resident, would not affect the property because the outcome of the discussion would have no bearing on whether the proposal went ahead or not. To find otherwise would mean that sellers were required to disclose matters that may be no more than gossip. In summary, the court considered these terms should not be construed too widely so as to force sellers to disclose speculative and remote information. There needs to be a degree of certainty that an event was likely to happen and would affect the property before an obligation to disclose arose. And the court considered the possible influence of the development on value alone was not enough to require disclosure. So quite a big development, 740 properties, offices, not that far away from you. It's definitely going to affect the roads. But I said earlier, it's subjective. So clearly the Thorpes were aggrieved that they thought this will affect their use and enjoyment of the property. But someone else might not be too bothered about it. So as I said, it's subjective. We shouldn't make ours shouldn't be to say whether it's a good or bad thing, but we're certainly in a position to advise clients what's going on in the surrounding area. So why not tell them? So there is some planning information. The local search, I've said a couple of times in the last half an hour, some of this information isn't in it, but there is some planning information in the local authority search, but it's limited to the curtilage of the property, so the boundary. Actually, I'll take that back. There's some information outside of the curtilage, but they are limited to, and I think I'm going to have to refer to notes 3.5. Here we go. Nearby railway schemes, is the property or will it be within 200 metres of the centre line of a proposed railway, tramway, light railway or monorail? And there's a little bit on traffic schemes as well. 3.6, has the local authority approved but not yet implemented any of the following roads, footways and footpaths which abut the boundary of the property? So there is a little information outside of the curtilage, but not very much. Certainly none of the case studies that I've mentioned would show up in the local authority search. So we've got a planning report, we call it Plan Search Plus. What else is in it? So it's got all the planning applications that go out to 750 metres. We also show, we call them land use designations. So we show, for instance, open land, or open land is more likely to be developed than greenbelt land. So taking you back to Hollingworth, with the second case study, that's hatched in green on that little snippet. There's more likely to be developed than greenbelt or brownbelt land, and it is. We also show rights of way. We also show education. So schools within a 5 kilometre. So in old money, that's 3.1 miles, I think. So we show we show education. We show primary, secondary, further. So for instance, if we lived in this area, this is a PF postcode, looks like it's near Chichester in West Sussex. It's not that close to us, but anyway, if we live near here, my daughter is definitely not going to any of the good ones. She's going to the outstanding one. That's the one without any other detail. That would be my first choice. When she's old enough to go to secondary education, she is definitely not going to a school that requires improvement. We're going to find another one. And if she wants to go to school for performing arts, now that's a drama and stage school. I know that because my niece went there. That requires improvement. If my daughter wants to go to such an establishment, she's not going to this one. So there's a lot of information here that's useful if you're not that familiar with the area. Even if you are, you might not know the school results. So there's post box, post offices. My elderly parents are looking to move, and at the top of the list are those of you that are familiar with conveyancing will know this. Elderly people, my parents want to be near a bus route and they want to be near local shops. So this and a lot of other stuff is shown under the amenities section. We also show where the nearest doctors, dentists, chemists, vets, restaurants, pubs, cafes, fast food outlets, general stores, convenience stores, supermarkets, DIYs, shopping centres, golf range. There's an awful lot of stuff in here. And we produce this report. It's a PDF. excuse me, we show it in a format where the front page is easy to interpret in an at-a-glance format, which is how conveyancers and property buyers tell us they want to see the information. And pretty modestly priced as well. I think £31 plus VAT is the price we charge for it. So coming on to the last bit of the presentation, I've called this simplifying the search pack. So simplifying search pack. So we have a property called Risk View Residential that includes planning information. It's one report. It's 5 searches in one, so it includes contaminated land, flood, energy and infrastructure. So energy and infrastructure for us is, so energy would be wind farms, solar farms, energy exploration, including hydraulic fracturing, renewable energy plants. Infrastructure would be HS2, Crossrail 1, Crossrail 2. Ground hazards, so that's mining and stability, and planning applications. So all of those, which not so long ago were individual reports, you can now buy in one report. So it shows the planning applications in detail. I think it's a really good thing. I don't know why anyone would want another report. Frankly, you can buy individual reports, but I think this is the way forward. So why would you buy this one? There's a couple of benefits. It's an all-in-one report. Comprehensive due diligence. It's the only report built for the digital age. What we mean by that is there's a web page that mirrors everything in this report. So if you want to access that, you click on the front page of the PDF on your computer, and it opens up a web page that is bespoke to this property and shows, you know, all anything in the PDF is mirrored in the web page. You can have free reorder. So if the transaction is delayed, which is going to be very possible at the moment, then you can have a free one of these from Searches UK. Just let them know that it's, you know, for instance, more than 3 months out of date, and they'll supply you with a free one. They just contact us and we'll run it free of charge. And we also have unique subsidence claims data in the mining and subsidence part of the report. We have the highest contaminated land remediation free contribution. What that means is if the land is found to be contaminated by the local authority within 3 years of the date of the report, and what that means for the home buyer is they're liable for the expense of the cleanup, Landmark will pay up to £250,000 to fix it. Now that's excess free. Some of our competitors have an excess, so if you buy a competitor's report, you have to pay the first £5,000, for instance, of the report. If you buy a Landmark report, you don't have to buy any. I've mentioned the online viewer, but we also have interactive planning data, so you can see all the planning applications on a map. I find it easier to look at the planning applications on a computer page or a tablet page or a phone page, rather than thumbing through multiple pages of a PDF. And we also have, we call it remediated land data, so we call it a RALRA. So what this means is if we have information where we've been told by a client or a local planning authority that the land has been remediated, or if they don't plan to, the local authority doesn't plan to investigate the property or the site or the development as part of their contaminated land strategy, we will pass that property. We will bank the data, so any future investigations of that property will automatically pass if it's a Landmark report. So what it means is you get more first-time passes. It's just quicker. Here's an example of the online viewer. So you click on the front page of the PDF. I've got a few snippets here, so you click on it. These are just showcasing the planning applications. There you go. There's a little red circle around the little orange house in Cherry Tree Lane there. You click on it, it shows this 28 houses. There's an application there. 28 houses refused, 2015. Refused again in 2016. If you click on the reference, it opens up a link to, in this case, East Riding of Yorkshire Planning Authority, and you can see more details, comments, maps, documents, you know, all sorts of useful information. So just to summarise planning, I think clients will want to know planning information that could affect the enjoyment of the property. The planning is subjective. You know, I might love that view, someone else might not be too bothered. Local authority search, the local authority search just looks at mainly looks at authority with the exception of nearby railway schemes and traffic schemes. The Plan Search Plus report, or the Risk View Residential, which incorporates planning, or the Commercial Site Check Planning report for commercial transactions includes planning, and they look at major energy and infrastructure applications as well. So I did say we'd have about 45 or 50 minutes, and I'm pretty much bang on. For those of you that need a reference for your SRA logs, you can quote the continuing competence reference EGM/LING. And if you'd like a free either planning report or a risk view residential report run on your own property or a property that you're familiar with either, contact Sam Manning, so samantha.manning@searcheruk.co.uk, or myself, Philip with 1L.hill at landmark.co.uk. That's Philip with 1L.hill, H-I-L-L, landmark.co.uk, and I'll be pleased to provide one free of charge to you. Okay, everyone, thank you very much for listening. Have a lovely day.